Let's go to Chip Pitts now. Mr. Pitts, there is talk of Libya becoming divided in the future, and many say that the situation is becoming more like Somalia. How do you assess the situation?
Well, clearly that's one possible scenario in the future. At present, there's the stalemate that's going on that could continue, in fact, for years. It's quite clear, unlike what many people said at the outset, that the rebels are not capable. It's a very small force, and even their most ardent supporters admit that they're incapable and require the training that's now being offered by advisors from the UK and Italy and France and so forth. But it's quite clear they can't win, even with the air power. And so although John McCain from the U.S. said hope is not a strategy over the weekend, it seems to be the strategy. So one scenario is that the stalemate continues. Other scenarios are that what happens, that the hope that actually Defense Secretary Robert Gates articulated happens, and that's that there is a solution by what he called a bullet in the back of the head. In other words, that someone will kill Gaddafi. Another solution, quote unquote, is that there is enough defections that the regime sort of crumbles under its own weight. Or I think the solution that we should all strive for is a negotiated solution, that there is actually a negotiated departure of Gaddafi. But the risk is that by increasing the war through this escalation, the enhanced airstrikes, the drones, you actually may make that much less likely, to a greater extent even than the International Criminal Court resolution from the UN, by actually having Gaddafi and his sons, his family, and his supporters in fear of their lives, backing up against a wall like cornered rats, making it much more difficult to reach the sort of solution that you had, for example, with Foreign Minister Moussa Koussa, who was excused in a sense. He was allowed to leave and given a sort of immunity. And sometimes we just don't realize the unintended consequences of these overly harsh actions. So while division for a long time is a possibility, I don't think that that's a possibility that's politically palatable to either the NATO forces or to the Obama administration, which, after all, is already in the midst of a 2012 presidential election.
Now, Dr. Craig Roberts, you spoke about drones as well. From where do these drones operate? I mean, because technically they cannot operate and fly from Italy because of a shortage of fuel. So where do they operate?
I don't know. Could be off of American naval vessels. I believe the last report about the drones did come from a Navy officer. I'd like to add something to this conversation. Probably the biggest risk, and the one that's being ignored, is China's attitude. The Chinese companies are losing hundreds of millions from this intervention. They have 50 massive investments there. It's all going down the drain. And this is clearly perceived by China as an act against them. They don't have any illusions. They don't read the New York Times or the Washington Post and believe all of that crap. So what they see is a move of the Americans against China. They're our biggest creditor.
So what you're saying, Doctor, is that the Americans want to take out China and replace Libya with Americans?
Or anybody, yeah.
Anybody but the Chinese?
That's right. And I think the Russians are beginning to perceive that the whole Syrian thing is a move against them, the base there. So what we're really doing is antagonizing two large countries. China, which has now got an economy that is probably better than ours because they haven't offshored all their jobs. And the Russians have unlimited nuclear arsenal. And so we're starting to press very strong countries in a very reckless way. We're behaving in a very reckless and dangerous way. And once you start this and Russia and China come to the conclusion that the Americans simply cannot be dealt with in any rational way, and are determined to somehow subdue them and do them damage, all kinds of escalations can result. And so this is the real danger. I mean, we're risking here a major war.
Indeed. All right, Mr. Chipitz, how much do you think that the U.S. war on Libya is for business interests rather than the interest of, rather the war being in the interest of the revolutionaries in Libya?
Are you asking me?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Chipitz.
Well, I actually think it's important to recognize that, you know, there are multiple strands of causes, so to speak, for this action. You know, some people were in the administration in Washington were authentically trying to validate the so-called responsibility to protect, this nascent doctrine that if a government is unable to protect its citizens or acts affirmatively to kill them or torture them, as Gaddafi has been doing for years, then it's up to the international community to step in. But then, as you say, there are these other interests that are tainted, the geopolitical situation with China, the fact that Libya does have the second largest oil reserves. All of these different factors can come into play. But what we have now is it's obvious that the action that the Obama administration and its allies, you know, Sarkozy in France, Cameron in the UK, and now NATO have taken was very, very precipitous and unthoughtful, because we now have a confusion over the ends of the action, the objectives. Is it regime change, or is it merely defensive protection of civilians as required by the UN Security Council resolution? We also have major questions about the means taken. You know, we're seeing the sort of escalation and mission creep that we saw in Korea, that we saw in Vietnam. And so we're not learning the lessons of history. I think what's important to realize at this point is that it is imperative, and it's in everyone's interest, to have, you know, a more sensible, rapid focus on a negotiated end to the crisis.
Right. Dr. Craig Roberts, we see Italy in between this whole crisis here. Libya used to be Italy's colony. What role does Italy play in here? Dr. Roberts? Mr. Chipitz, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, go ahead and you answer this question. I think we've lost Dr. Roberts for the time being.
Okay, I think that Italy's role, you know, as the former colonial power, it was reluctant to get involved originally, even though it was pressured strongly by the Obama administration, the UK, and so forth. I think that the current, you know, involvement of Italy in airstrikes has likely been trumpeted in part to make it seem that NATO has unwavering and growing commitment to the Libyan action. But that's misleading. Deep divisions continue, as many people have noted, including supporters of the Libyan action like John McCain. Only 6 of NATO's country members are actively taking part. Now, the actual role of Italy could actually produce a backlash. As the former colonial power, it could actually be used by Gaddafi loyalists in propaganda, and you could say that, you know, there are these foreign interveners. That risk is made even more significant with the use of these drones, these robotic, you know, predator drones that have caused such problems in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leading to, you know, even the government involved in Pakistan's case objecting that its citizens are being killed. And the drones have resulted in a disproportionate death of innocent people. That's inevitable. It's supposed to be a very precise technology, and yet the collateral damage is quite significant even with the drones. And the fact that you've got these, you know, superior technological forces, the robots killing from the sky, can be very, very harmful symbolically. That's why I personally think it was a grave strategic error to begin to rely on the drones in this, you know, yet another war that the United States is involved in.
All right, Mr. Pitts, it seems we've got Dr. Paul Craig Roberts back online. We lost you there for a moment, Doctor. We were speaking with Mr. Pitts about the role of Italy in Libya. How do you see it?
Yes, I could hear it. Yes, I could hear that. I don't know why you lost my voice. We did lose the Skype connection, but we're using the telephone from ours.
That's very usual on live interviews anyway. Apologies there, sir. Go ahead. Well,
you know, look, here's another unique thing about this particular intervention. What is NATO doing fighting a war in Africa? NATO was formed to guard against the potential of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The Soviet Union has been gone for 20 years. And NATO has been turned into an auxiliary force. Pentagon in Washington and Afghanistan. And so now we have NATO involved in an aggressive war in Africa. This is a war of aggression, a war of attack. So this is an extraordinary development. I mean, why is this happening? We didn't use NATO in Egypt or Tunisia, and we certainly won't use it in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. So again, we see something highly unusual, a brand new development, NATO at war in Africa. This needs some sort of explanation.
Indeed. All right. I'm sorry we have to leave it there, Doctor. That's all the time we had on this edition of News Analysis for Press TV. Thank you there to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary to U.S. Treasury, joining me via Skype from Panama City. And we had Chip Pitts, political commentator, on the phone from Dallas. Many thanks, and appreciate your time and thoughts and opinions there, gentlemen.